An important king move, but also a complicated king move, is called castling. So I'm separating that out here so that we can discuss the rules governing castling. Castling is a king move that's made early on in the game after the pieces have moved out onto the board and you want to move to protect your king. Because the king is the most valuable piece, you do not like to leave your king exposed in the middle of the game when all of the pieces are out to attack. It's like being outside when all of these lions and tigers and bears are coming to attack you. You want to run inside your house and close the door behind you to safety. There's a special move which allows the king to do just that. And this move is called castling. Castling is a king move. Because you have the rule of touch move, you must touch the king first. Castling happens the very first time you ever move the king. Just like the very first time you ever move a pawn, you have a choice of moving it 1 square or 2 squares. The very first time you move a king, you can castle. You cannot castle once the king has moved. Just like the pawn can move 2 squares on its first move, in castling, the king gets to move 2 squares. This is how it looks. The king moves 2 squares, 1, 2, into his house and shuts the door behind him. The rook slides in right next to the king. Let me show that again, okay? The king moves 2 squares, 1, 2, and slams the door behind him. This is the only move in which the king gets to move 2 squares. It's the only move in chess where you get to move 2 pieces at once, and it's the only move where the rook jumps. So that's a very special, exceptional move. Now the king can castle king side, which is the side of the board the king is on, or he can castle queen side. It's the same thing. 1, 2, and the rook drops in. Because the king has to move further when he's going queen side, it looks a little bit different. When he moves 2 squares and shuts the door behind him, he's 2 squares away from the end of the board. When he castles king side, 1, 2, he's 1 square away from the board. The thing to remember is that the king always moves 2 squares and the rook always drops down on the square right next to the king. Now, check again is a governing principle in castling. Say this pawn moves up and says check. The king is not allowed to castle out of check. He has to get out of check, but he cannot castle out of check. He would have to move. Okay? He can't capture this pawn because it's protected by the queen. So he would have to move. Let's say the pawn is here and the king wants to castle. The king is not allowed to castle through check. This pawn is guarding this square. So the king could not castle this way because he's not allowed to move through check. The king is never allowed to be in check. He's moving 2 squares. Even though he doesn't stay here, he's moving onto that square. The king is not allowed to move into check. Of course, he could castle this way. 1, 2, castle, because he's not in check. And obviously, the king is not allowed to castle into check. So, if this king were here, he couldn't castle because he would be castling out of check. Let's move the pawn there. But he also couldn't castle here because he would be castling into check. And the king is not allowed to be in check. So in castling, it has to be the first time the king moves. And the king is not allowed to castle out of check, through check, or into check.